Hello, everybody, and welcome to this COP26 event. I'm Martin Baxter. I'm Policy and External Affairs Director at the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session on understanding and leveraging business interests to accelerate landscape restoration. Clearly, it's a vital time, and I think today is a really exciting part of COP as we bring together that intersection between both climate change and biodiversity and natural capital enhancement. And what better way to do that than through the lens of landscape enterprise networks. We have a really exciting program, some fantastic speakers. So we're going to have a really exciting time over the next hour and a half. Please, if you are able, you can use the chat function. We do have small amounts of time during the session where we will be hopefully able to deal with some of those, but if not, if there's an opportunity, we might be able to feedback remotely. But we're really keen to see the dialogue and comments that you're able to submit, so please use that. So our first part of this session is going to be looking at some of the key challenges in scaling landscape restoration and how the landscape enterprise networks can really help to overcome these. We have Tom Curtis and Andy Griffiths, who've been heavily involved with landscape enterprise networks, and they're going to kick off this session now. So I think I'm handing over to Andy and Tom.
That's great. Thanks, Martin, and a real privilege to be here today. So I'm Andy Griffiths. I'm one of the co-developers of the Landscape Enterprise Networks model, an independent model to help enable businesses to come together to accelerate landscape restoration. I'm also head of value chain sustainability for Nestle UK and Ireland.
And I'm Tom Curtis, and along with Andy, co-developed the Lens model from the start, but obviously now subsequently with a whole range of people from the Lens community. And I'm a partner of Three Keel, which is a sustainability advice business based in Oxford.
Thanks, Tom. So in this first session, we're really going to talk about some of the challenges that we've seen and experienced in terms of accelerating the scale and pace of landscape restoration, and how Lens has evolved to help address those challenges and drive effectively what we would call environmental commerce-based solutions, so enabling the flow of funds into farmers, land managers and communities to enable those changes to be delivered. So we started working on the development of the Lens model probably about 4 years ago now. And as part of that, the first stage was really to understand why, when businesses are so dependent on nature and on landscapes, there was relatively little investment from businesses in terms of supporting that transformation. We got a range of different feedback, but probably the biggest theme that came back was the approach that's typically taken. And largely what tends to happen is an organisation or a group of organisations will look at a particular landscape, identify the key challenges or issues, develop a proposition to address those, and then take them to business to try and engage and drive investment into delivering that proposition. And largely the biggest challenge with that approach has tended to be that the businesses have struggled to understand why this proposition is relevant to them and what value it would deliver, and therefore typically haven't then lent in and invested into the proposition. So as part of that analysis, what we did was really flipped that approach on its head and looked at how we could develop a model which would really help businesses understand the relevance of nature to them, making therefore the proposition business-centric, but also making sure that from a delivery perspective, the programme really brought together those farmers, those land managers and the communities who are based within that landscape to drive change, to deliver change. So it's both business-centric in terms of the funding, the development proposition, but it's also community and farmer-centric in terms of delivery. And in terms of the core proposition, again, a real concern that we didn't want to bias landscape restoration in a particular direction. Clearly, at the moment, there's a lot of focus on carbon and climate climate neutrality, what we wanted to make sure was that really we leveraged multifunctional landscapes. So really identifying that nature can deliver a range of different outcomes, which are relevant to different businesses in different ways, and making sure that if we took that approach, we got much more balanced landscapes, but also much more effective investment. The other core element was really, as part of developing the program and making it relevant to business, was making sure that we focused on dependencies. Businesses understand their dependencies, understand the dialogue of risk. And therefore, if you look at a landscape, a business may have an interest in terms of water quality, or it may have an interest in terms of soil quality or supply resilience, but you can map those outcomes back to the natural assets that deliver those outcomes. So therefore really help those businesses understand where they're dependent on the landscape, and then make sure that we optimize those interactions. So as a result, we identified that from a lens perspective, if we were going to develop a model, there were some core basic principles that we need to consider and integrate. The first one is it has to be demand-led. We need to make sure that this relates back to the interests of both the businesses and the other organisations and communities who are dependent upon that landscape, that it's multifunctional, that it's collaborative across the entirety of the model. It's business-like, so there's real clarity as to how this operates and ensuring that everyone is protected within this, but there's a flow of funds to support those organisations to deliver the relevant outcomes. It's organic growth. We're not trying to wrap everything in at first stage. And most importantly, it's place-based. So different organisations have different interests, but fundamentally the model is focused on delivering a place-based set of outcomes. So I'll pass over to Tom to talk through some of the key principles in a little bit more detail.
Sure thing. Thanks very much, Andy. So exactly as Andy said, that's those are the principles that underpin how we've developed Lens. But essentially, what this started out as was the concept, as Andy stated it. Really was how do we turn the way we normally look at landscapes on its head, so that we can really get proper money into them to build sustainability. And the way we did that was to start building a system of ecosystem commerce, which has emerged with those sets of principles that Andy described there. And we started building that, first of all, our first Lens landscape in Cumbria in northwest England. And so I'm going to use Cumbria as my means of describing through those principles. And just to sort of reiterate that the we in this instance, as ever with Lens, is a Lens community, a Lens trading community. And in Cumbria, that's a whole range of stakeholders, private sector, NGO, local authority, and academics, in fact, in Cumbria in particular, that have made this happen. And Lens more generally is a wider community. Lens is about community building and trading community building. So the first of those principles that Andy outlined there was this is demand-led, and just taking Nestlé's interest here and to illustrate why demand-led really matters. We could have said to Nestlé has a factory, you can see in the top right-hand side here, a milk processing factory in a place called Dalston in the north of Cumbria. Now, we could try to sell that landscape to Nestlé on the basis that it's a wonderful landscape, and it is, on the doorstep of a World Heritage site, and that they might want to donate into that landscape, and that we'd get some traditionally some kind of comeback on that. But ultimately, straightforwardly, I think it's not too hard to say that Nestlé as a business views that landscape through the lens of milk. Nestlé gets all of its milk for that Dalston factory from within 50 kilometres of the factory. So whilst it loves, adores, loves and values and supports that wider landscape for a whole range of reasons, fundamentally it needs milk from that landscape. And actually what that means is that Nestlé is as dependent on the assets in that landscape that underpin milk production things like soils in particular, but also in a more roundabout way, the trees and the watercourses. It's as dependent on those assets in that landscape as the ones that it owns within the factory gates itself. And so actually what that does is it means that Nestlé has a vested interest in investing in, for example, soils in that landscape, in order that it can go on get ongoing production of milk into its Dalston plant. So that's why we'd sell that landscape on the basis of milk, not not on the basis, in the first instance, of the wider environment itself, because that's what underpins Nestlé's key interest and its key perception of risk. The other second thing you rapidly come on to there is that, of course, the soils, the trees and the watercourses for that landscape, they underpin milk production, the ongoing fertility and productive capacity of that landscape. They also underpin a range of other functions that are critical to the functioning of Nestlé's factory and their business operation. They've got commitments around greenhouse gas emissions. And if you're looking after the soils and the trees, you're also delivering against those. And also, critically, Nestlé has important logistics associated with that landscape. It needs to get product in and out and staff in and out. And that landscape floods. And so soils, trees, watercourses actually also are critical assets underpinning water catchment management and the management and reduction of flooding. So actually what you see is that those core assets that underpin Nestlé's interest not only underpin its milk production into the factory, they're also assets that underpin a range of other critical functions for the factory. And that starts to pile on the business case for Nestlé. And it starts to make looking after those assets, investing in those assets, really, really makes sense for them. But of course, on top of that, what we then realised is that Nestlé isn't alone in that regard, that other businesses in that landscape and the local authority have a vested interest in those same assets, but actually for a range of different outcomes. So, for example, we've engaged and are trading with the local water company, United Utilities, because looking after soils, looking after watercourses, and looking after trees and hedgerows is actually really helpful for them in terms of ensuring that the watercourses and the water catchment are clean and it reduces things like, in particular, phosphorus content in those water supplies and in those watercourses. So it does a job for them as well, and it does a job for organisations that are interested in reducing flood risk, the local authority in particular in that landscape. And so what we can do and have done there is build a consortia of buyers to procure those nature-based solutions based on securing those soil, tree and watercourse assets in that landscape. And the reason that really matters is because they can share costs. It means that they're not all, that not one of them, it's not just one of them trying to foot the bill in that landscape. They can share those costs. And that means that it takes nature-based solutions, which might not otherwise have a full business case, by stacking up the different outcomes and by pulling in more than one customer, we can, to pay for it, it starts to make sense. You put a whole range of different nature-based solutions into the viable realm. That's critical. And so collaborative, business-led is absolutely underpins the Lens model. So then how do we transact that? Well, the fourth principle critically is that Lens is very much about being business-like, about saying, look, this is business need, and let's turn this into a transaction. Can we find people who can deliver against that? And so what we do is we understand those business needs. We understand where they overlap, like I've just been describing. Different business needs, different drivers. The first order question is, well, Nestlé wants milk and the water company wants clean water and the local authority wants to reduce flooding. The second order question, though, is, oh, actually, if you want that, you all want a common set of assets to be in good fettle in that landscape. So we can convene businesses around those common interests. And simply what we do is we build a technical understanding of that common interest. And out of that, we build a specification for services. And with that, we can go out to grouped farmers in the landscape and say, well, what can you do for that? What can you do for us that delivers against our specification for services? And we deal always with people who can bring together a range of farmers in the landscape. We call them a supply aggregator. And that means they can negotiate on behalf of those farmers for an equitable deal, but also it means we can get landscape scale solutions and help build build the capacity that farmers need. So we negotiate then. They come back with a proposal. We negotiate until we've got the right proposal for the need, and then we cut a deal. And the deal is a commercial transaction, commercial negotiation. It's not based on a theoretical valuation. It's straightforward. It gives a profit to the supply aggregator, and it's a good deal for the demand side. And that's how we arrive at our ecosystem service valuation. It differs depending on where you are. Having cracked that deal, we pull together demand and we link it to aggregated supply, cut a deal. We then grow that over time within that landscape by cutting and finding new deals. We build a pipeline of deals. So we're not trying to solve the whole landscape all at once. We build complexity incrementally over time, and start to draw in wider and more complex range of different interests into that landscape and different transactions into that landscape. And that's how we build and respond to the local and evolving needs of the regional community and business sector within a region. And it's how we start to fund the landscape as it is in that place. And so then finally the sixth principle is that it is place-based. In order to be able to build that complexity and respond to place and to the particularities of that location, we need to do this and organise this and have this owned and run in place in a region. This isn't a remote transaction done from London or done from either by government or by business. Actually, in order to be able to weave this together and get multifunctionality and something which is responsive to the needs of that landscape, and these are precious landscapes, all of them, and diverse landscapes, we get that weaving, we get that commonality of interest in place. In order to do that, as we start to build a range, a network of trades, we recognise the need and are building now regional organisational infrastructure, governance structures to be able to pull together those trades and build a subsequent pipeline of trades. And those lens entities, those regional lens entities, governed by their demand community and their supply community, accountable to statutory bodies, focused on building trades and managing trades and building a pipeline of trades which represents the needs of that place, is what we're constructing now in our lens areas, in our lens regions. Those are regional lens entities which will be affiliated to a wider lens network. And that's essentially what's shaken out of the original proposition that Andy put to us, really, of how to construct this new way of transacting and building ecosystem commerce. And so that's lens, and that's how it works.
Thanks, Tom. That's a great explanation. And I think, as Tom alluded to, the really critical element here is that this isn't about organisations stepping in and buying the landscape. This is about organisations funding the restoration of those landscapes. And it is very much structured to be community-centric, so bringing in those communities to help support and enable the delivery, but also to help shape the delivery. So what's really key here is that all of the players across this arrangement have a sphere of influence in terms of shaping how this is structured and delivered. So as we've continued to evolve the model, we're very clear that this is an evolving model, and all of the organisations and different partnerships, again, this is inclusive. So we bring partnerships in. This isn't about pushing out existing delivery partners. It's about bringing them in and helping to accelerate growth through funding. So basically, as we've done that, we've seen rapid growth of the programme in recent times. So we now have a range of programmes in different stages of evolution and delivery across the UK. Again, looking at very different landscapes and very different outcomes with a range of quite different partners from different sectors. And now starting to move into Europe, with some key markets, for example, in Italy and Hungary, where we're developing programs, and in discussions, very exciting discussions with other countries as well. But what's really important is the scale of flow as well. So although Tom's point was we start small, we've already got several million pounds committed through some of these programs, with some of the core programs being in East Anglia, and then also in southwest Scotland and Cumbria, where we're seeing those funds committed and flowing through to the farmers and land managers and community partners who are delivering those programs for us. So we've talked about it being a multi-stakeholder program, but why are partners engaging? I won't spend too much time on this, because in the next slot, you'll actually hear from some of those partners who'll be able to verbalise it much better than I can. But we are seeing very different expectations and interests playing through, although some of them are common as well. So from a business perspective, a key aspect is around risk management and efficiency, but also for some, it's about growing top line. Some it's about reducing the bottom line, but largely around risk management. But the other key thing is, particularly for the early organisations who've lent in, there's a really key focus on really building the proposition now, making sure that we're delivering action and outcomes now, but also working with those academic partners that Tom referenced earlier to build the evidence base to ensure that we can further refine the decision making going forwards and have even greater impact. From a farmer and land manager perspective, again, very much about resiliency for their own business models, for their own farms, that shared agency proposition. So what's been really key is that the farmers have the ability to shape and develop the delivery program. They're not being told what to do. And also, although we talk a lot about trades, Lens is very, very focused and structured around providing ongoing support, bringing in advisors, allowing farmers to identify their own advisors, to build those propositions and support delivery on an ongoing basis. From a public sector perspective, real opportunities to deliver efficiency for the public purse. Also, that Lens is an independent proposition. It isn't a business or profit-driven proposition. This is about cycling the funds back into landscape delivery. And then from societal perspective, again, that shared agency piece, delivering balanced outcomes, the fact that these communities are at the centre of these propositions and can help shape the delivery within them, but also that it's scalable. So we start, we would say relatively small, for others perhaps is quite large, but that we can rapidly scale beyond that as we build further interest into the programme. We've also been doing work with a number of partners, and again, particularly in Cumbria and southwest Scotland, looking at blended finance solutions as well. So not only how we can deliver efficient outcomes for business investors and for the institutional investors and reinsurers that sit behind them, but also the ability to blend that public and private finance to deliver much more effective outcomes. So not blocking or running those kind of public funded propositions with the business ones in parallel, really bring them together to deliver integrated solutions. And what's really key about that is, as we touched on, it delivers real economic efficiency and enables us to increase the pace and scale that we can drive landscape restoration. But it's also, although we started focusing originally very much on environmental outcomes, as the Lens model has evolved, we've seen a number of other outcomes play through. So one is the ability for Lens to catalyse social and economic regeneration within the landscape by bringing those funds into the community and enabling them to drive that change, which has been really crucial. But also we're seeing not just different sectors leveraging the model in terms of delivering ecosystem outcomes, but also product-based outcomes. So if you select the right interventions, you can deliver those multiple outcomes, but you can also deliver product as well. So whether it's coppiced product for different businesses, or for example, if you're planting hedgerow, selecting the right hedgerow to grow berries or nuts, which may be of interest to other players as well. So very much a product and service-based proposition. But to be really clear, the way Lens is structured is for those organisations like agri-food, we manage the procurement of our goods on the one hand. Lens doesn't deal with that. Lens then really focuses on the delivery of those services and the products that are associated with those services. So that's an overview of some of the challenges that we're facing in terms of landscape restoration and how Lens is evolving and delivering to address some of those challenges. So I'll hand back to Martin to see if there's been any questions raised.
Right, well, firstly, Andy, Tom, thank you for getting this session underway. A really great explanation of Lens and, you know, just how not only conceptually does this play out, but actually starting to get into practice. And shortly we'll move on to, you know, see some of the actors in play, and that would be great. So we have one question through. So do you see this as a way to internalise what, you know, are normally classed as externalised costs of production in production chains? Is this, you know, how do you view that from a Nestlé perspective? Is probably a good way to view that.
Yeah, absolutely. So both from a Nestlé and from a Lens perspective, we absolutely see that as a core proposition. So I think natural capital accounting, natural capital valuation is crucial. But really, it's been very difficult for a lot of businesses to use that and apply that. And really for us, the key is driving pace now, driving action now. So the benefit of Lens is it enables businesses to understand their dependencies on nature, understand the value, therefore, that those natural assets and the services that they're delivering mean to that business, and therefore, you know, understand how much they need to fund to deliver those outcomes. So it really does help internalize those, but in a way which is dependency based and means that the business it's relevant to the businesses. But also as part of that, because of that approach, it means that we can bring those organisations together to co-fund and deliver it in a much more efficient and integrated way. So it does enable that internalisation, but it also enables that efficient delivery as well.
Right, and I guess that, you know, what we're seeing here is, sorry, Tom, go on.
No, crack on, Martin, yeah.
But I was going to say, I mean, I think what you're then able to do, aren't you, is just say, you know, what's it going to cost us to enhance the resilience of our supply chain in terms of that natural capital? So you then get a much clearer line about how you can look at the value of it, but also, you know, how you're going to, you know, account for that in ways that maybe others in the business find a lot easier to relate to.
Absolutely, and I won't steal Chris's thunder for his session, but I think for some sectors, it also helps take cost out of current approaches. So, you know, the opportunity to move from kind of hard solutions to nature-based solutions not only helps, you know, restore those landscapes, but can actually take cost out of the business as well. So that there's some really strong business propositions beyond just the kind of resilience side.
And that's kind of critical, isn't it? That you know, this isn't based around a compensation from these businesses back to the landscape. It's based on the businesses saying, hang on, we collectively need this landscape to work for us in the long term if we're going to continue to carry on operating. And I think very importantly, by getting cross-sector investment into this, or cross-sector transactions going, actually they can share the costs of that, because it's, you know, one might say that, you know, the food system can't, you know, hasn't got enough money in it to restore the landscape on its own. Actually, we need a range of sectors from society to club together to turn this around and then to put our landscapes back into a condition that will serve future generations.
Yeah, and I think what's really exciting is that, you know, you can see very clearly how we're now starting to get real pathways to get private sector finance into not just halting the decline of nature, but actually that restorative process, which I think is, and it's aligned to, you know, very clear business benefits. So I think that, you know, it's a really smart aspect of this. Just one quick question before we move on to the next. You know, what have you seen so far as the most challenging aspect of working the Lens model? Because I think, you know, when I look at this, is it collecting, you know, groups of businesses together that have those dependencies and working through what those common outputs might be? Is it around the suppliers and the providers of nature-based solutions and getting those in, you know, what are the key areas that you find that may be most challenging that you might not have initially thought, I guess, would be quite interesting to know.
Yeah, I guess a few elements. So one is, I think in the early stages, we're okay with the level of delivery capacity and advisory capacity, but I think, looking forwards, that's going to be a challenge for landscape restoration as a whole. So we're really looking as part of Lens at how we can help enable the growth of that capacity. So that's one key element. I think another one is there are plenty of pieces of the jigsaw on the table from an evidence perspective, but there are also plenty of pieces still missing. And perhaps some organisations use that as an excuse not to take action. Our view is really clear that we need to lean in now, do the work on the ground and work with academic partners to build that evidence base around it. And hopefully in the third slot, you'll hear from some of our colleagues in terms of how we're starting to open that up.
Yeah, and just very briefly, I fully agree with Andy on that. Verification monitoring, as that grows and evolves and standardizes, that's going to really help. But we haven't had it as a blocker, because you can take action as long as you can satisfy your buyers that you're delivering something viable to them. These are direct transactions; they're not remote fungible credits in the first instance. So you can just demonstrate quality. But just in very practical terms, the first and most difficult thing to do is to get that first demand consortium together. When you get a demand consortium together, you can get supply. You just can, because there's money on the table. But convincing businesses from totally different sectors that they have a common interest, they just can't. That's a conceptual leap. But having got the first group together, then others join. So it's always getting that first demand group off the ground. Once you do that, you're moving, basically.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tom and Andy. We're going to move on now, and I think there's a whole new question about skill sets, about how collaboration and partnership working, which can actually be kind of quite difficult, but maybe that might come out in the next session. So we're now going to move on to hear perspectives from some of the key organisations who've been engaging in landscape enterprise network programs. We have a range of businesses, regulators, others, so really excited to hear from that. First, I'm going to invite Kirsten from Purina. Hi. So, Purina, you've been one of the early adopters of Lens in enabling landscape restoration. So, why did you get involved? Why was this a big issue for you?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Martin, and very pleased to be here. So maybe a bit of context for us as a pet care company. Our parent company, Nestle, has announced in 2019 that we're committed to achieving net zero by 2050, so embarked on the science-based target. Only a year later, we shared a very detailed roadmap with regenerative agriculture being one of the key strategic pillars. And that is something that in Purina, of course, we are contributing to, and we have been and work with our teams to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So that was a little bit the starting point. The majority of our greenhouse gas emissions is attributed to ingredients. So if we want to significantly reduce our carbon emissions, we need to as well address what ingredients we use and how we source them. So that's why Regen Ag is really absolutely crucial for us for reducing our emissions, but as well the wider regeneration strategy that we have, improving water, soil health, biodiversity. And then, having said that, through Andy, we got in contact with Lens, and there are 4 areas that we found really super powerful and made us early adopters. First, the structure of Lens. It takes a system approach, and that enables really the restoration of multifunctional landscapes, and rely on that. And as you heard Andy and Tom before, it is absolutely critical from a resilience of the supply perspective, because that's on what we base our business proposition. Second, it's really driving the scale through collaborative action and funding and the efficiency of the funding. You mentioned it before, it's very difficult for only one company to fund that massive transformation that we have to enable in the food system. Third, it's farmer and community centric, so really enabling them as well to play a key role in the development of the program and the delivery. And last but not least, we truly believe it has the ability to drive sustainable change. It's an open model. It makes it highly scalable and easy to replicate as well in other markets and even other sectors. So for example, for us, we are looking as well at Italy and Hungary with 2 markets where we are developing as well programs. So that is in short why we believe it's very powerful, and we adopt it early.
Great. And so, I mean, do you really see this need for, a collaborative shared agency model like Lens to enable landscape restoration? I mean, are there not other models, or you've not tried other things?
We've for sure tried as well other things. We have other propositions in other countries that focus more on the educational piece, but the collaborative and shared agency model is absolutely needed, because our long-term ability to survive really depends on the condition of the nature and the landscape in which we operate. So restoring of the farmland is key for our long-term food crop productivity, water quality. So it's a matter that involves us all. And we know that we cannot do a transformation of this scale alone. That's why we believe in the value of collaboration with partners to address that challenge. And I think the results and the first results of our work with Lens really testify to that. And then second, I do believe, and we do believe, in the power of knowledge sharing when speed is needed. We have really limited growing cycles to transform regenerative agriculture at scale. So 2030 is one of the next tipping points where we need to have reduced our emissions by 20%. And until 2030, there are very limited growing cycles available. So we really need to work together. And I think driving the upskilling, maximizing environmental outcomes, finding the right way to measure results. We see this kind of program really as pioneering network for future trade. First, farmers can share their experience and best practices. And when we work together, we can really accelerate that common knowledge, pivot, understand on the journey how we can move faster. And so I think it's a great program. I think the success comes from the fact that it's ecosystem relevant and community based, and having farmers and communities at the center is hopefully creating a fast movement. So we do believe collaborative models play a very big role.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. That was a really great insight. I'm now going to move on to Chris Jarrett from Anglian Water, because I can see very clearly how this works if you're an agri-food company, and why you might engage. But for a water utility company like Anglian, what are the drivers for you to get involved and participate?
Well, good afternoon, Martin. It's great to be here. Our region is in the east of England. It covers about 28,000 square kilometres. And about half of England's best land for growing food is in our region. Consequently, over time, what we've seen is the vast majority of our region transformed into really high quality agriculture. It's called the breadbasket of England, and for good reason. We have got world-class agriculture across our landscapes, but it's not without its problems. So there are externalities in farming. And when we abstract water from rivers and our groundwaters to treat and to provide onto our customers, we sometimes have to deal with pesticides and nutrients and sediment. And what that does is drive up cost, as Andy said earlier. It drives up carbon, and it can drive down resilience, particularly in the face of climate change, and water resources is going to be a very different picture. So working with farmers collaboratively through Lens, it enables us to have contracts with farmers so they can do things on their land which delivers that water quality benefit. So things like cover crops in winter, holds onto nitrate, keeps the soil on the land as well. So that's great for us and for our customers. But also, it's also great for the water environment in general as well. So we can spend our money continuing to just treat water when we get it, but if we spend that money upstream in the landscape, then we get all sorts of wider environmental and social benefits as well, which are very closely aligned to our purpose as a company.
Right. So, I mean, how do you see the opportunities evolving in the future?
I see working across landscapes through mechanisms like Lens as really mushrooming in the future, I think. For a start, the water industry as a whole, and Anglian Water has got a 2030 net zero target, and we're going to have to do some carbon offsetting for that. And that means that we could be using Lens to work with farmers on things like soil carbon sequestration or tree planting, hedgerow planting, and things like that. But also we have biodiversity net gains and wider ambitions for nature recovery, which could play out through Lens as well. And indeed, with the future of climate change, I do wonder and expect that water resources could be managed more effectively through Lens by making sure that our landscapes help manage the water resource risks in terms of flood risk management, but also in terms of drought as well. So I think there's a whole set of opportunities that relate to our dependencies as a water business. But also we have impacts on the downstream environment as well, and depending on how the water sector is regulated and public policy changes in the future, we may be able to manage those the net impacts of our water operations by working across the landscapes as well. And of course, doing that collaboratively with other demand side like Nestle and Purina, it means we can really focus on that. And so the total magnitude of the impact we have will be much greater than the sum of our parts. So it's a really exciting model, and I'm sure that we'll be using it as a delivery mechanism for many years to come.
Great, thanks, Chris. And it's really good to see payments for ecosystem services in practice. So that's great. We're now going to hear from Sheena Horner from the Ayrshire Regional Food Group and Alistair Dobson from Taste of Arran, because I think it's been great to hear from big, large organisations that are either part of the the Nestle group or big water utility like Anglian Water, but for smaller organisations who are looking to get involved, I think it'd be really interesting to get their take. So, Alistair, what for you are the biggest challenges for an SME wanting to manage its dependencies on a local landscape?
The biggest challenge is always going to be understanding their part within the bigger opportunity for working in collaboration for a landscape partnership or a lens approach. And I think agriculture and small food manufacturing, and I'm sure in the larger food manufacturing companies as well, will say the margins are really wafer thin. So there has to be that cost out understanding. But I think driving the understanding about how the working in collaboration is going to gain a bigger prize, and it's all about, there's a real demand, especially now, about this just transition for rural economies in Scotland, and it's how every small company or every small organisation can get involved in aggregate, using Andy's terms, that aggregation. So I think the hardest part is just getting the communication and simplification of that for small businesses and smaller organisations.
Right, and so how do you see models such as Lens enabling them to play a role in this transition of both climate and nature's recovery?
Well, maybe I can comment and then let Sheena come in. I should always have let ladies first, but there we go. And so I've got to say a thank you to Andy from Nestle and Tom from Freekeel and from Lucy from SEPA for introducing the Lens approach to myself and some others that I've shared it with, because I really believe that it's got a fantastic opportunity, because there's lots of things coming down onto businesses and communities, and a demand from our customers to be looking at new ways of delivering, a bit more environmentally smart ways of doing things. And I've been working on something within the Isle of Arran, which is really engaging. It's our Arran 2030 plan, which is it's called an island in balance, a balance between our communities, our businesses, and our environment. And Lens, I think, can particularly deliver that. But the trouble, what I'd love to see and challenge, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of answers to this, but from a small location like the Isle of Arran, which an island, every action's got a reaction, Lens could be very much applied to that. But we don't have these anchor institutions, these bigger businesses. So how can the aggregated effect of the smaller businesses be delivered? But we do have big organisations. We've got Scottish Water have got interests in the island. We've got Forestry Land Scotland, Nature Scot, the local authorities, obviously, and our enterprise companies. So they've all got, and we've always said every action's got a reaction. Sometimes they come in and deliver their needs without really thinking of the reaction and sometimes the unintended consequences of what they do. So I think Lens could very much be part of that. I'll maybe hand to Sheena as well, Martin.
Yeah, I think Sheena's had some challenges with getting a connection. So I think we don't have her at the moment. I mean, I think what's really coming through from these discussions and contributions and insights is just that sense of place. So I think when you're talking about Arran, it's not just a landscape from an ecological ecosystem perspective, but really that whole community as well, which I think is really important about how we deliver change. Well, change has to happen in places, but it has to involve people. So I think this is a really insightful part of this whole Lens piece.
I totally agree, Martin. And the interesting thing is, we already started an organisation called the Arran Trust to allow people to engage. And the people we're talking about are the community of Arran, but also the community of our guests to Arran. We get 500,000 visitors a year, and they all want to put something back in. And we generate about between 50 and 100,000 pounds a year from voluntary donations that we then apply to environmental and educational schemes. So there's creative ways, maybe in different localities, and I think Tom mentioned this, it's not one size fits all. I think it's about getting your own solutions and your buy-in and I think the big thing for me is that balance of financial and emotional investment as well when you're making a business case or a value proposition as to how Lens could work. And I think Lens to me has really simplified things. It doesn't need to be complex, although there might be some complex arrangements within that, but it will be all about the people, that's for sure.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alistair. We're going to try and move on now to Kenny from the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency. Hopefully, I think you had a little bit of a challenge when with your internet, but hopefully you're okay. So, as a regulator, why is SEPA engaging in Lens, and where do you see the key opportunities? So you're on mute, Kenny. If you just come off mute, thanks.
I think I think we should all get T-shirts printed with that before this pandemic's over. I think Chris spoke very eloquently about the benefits from a kind of direct compliance perspective, but for me, this goes even deeper than that. In that, the world is changing. The world's a very different place. And regulation and the way we regulate has to change to keep pace with that. And the days of our regulatory efforts being entirely focused on point source, single issue, transactional regulation is these things are very, very, very glad to say largely things of the past, although they will remain obviously fundamental to the things that we do. So as a regulator, we're looking at other ways of engaging with regulated companies and companies who rely on services of regulated companies as part of the supply chain, and we've got big problems to solve, big issues to solve. Compliance, I would suggest, is probably the baseline, but going even beyond compliance to address some of the bigger and wider global challenges facing us is something as a regulator we take very seriously, and it's something at the heart of SEPA's One Planet Prosperity regulatory strategy. So we're looking for new ways to engage, ways to work with companies and to find ways of sharing agendas and structuring partnerships. And structure, for me, is a very, very important word, because often we get involved in these areas of work and it's down to a few very well-meaning and committed individuals, and lots of these initiatives wither and die on the vine as a consequence. Where Lens differs from me, and why I find it such an exciting prospect, and Murray spoke very, very eloquently there, it provides that structure, it provides that impetus, it targets what's important, and more importantly, it puts it at the heart of business practice. And it's by taking this action, not only are we addressing very important issues in terms of environmental protection, enhancement, development, biodiversity, all these kind of key issues that are so important at the current juncture. But it's also making companies more viable, more in some instances more profitable, but certainly more stable and providing jobs and investing in place. So for me, it is a win-win situation. It's a situation where we can regulate smartly. You know, I'm a great believer in this new concept of macro regulation, where we bring the regulatory focus up a level, and by working and engaging with boardrooms and stakeholders, we can realize those compliance benefits, which otherwise would be a very kind of old-fashioned, resource-intensive approach. So for me, Lens offers a huge opportunity to do things that otherwise we would struggle to do alone. And I'll finish on a point with, for me, the days of the clipboard being the barrier between the regulated and the regulated party are gone. The problems we've got to solve now are so complex and so challenging that we have to work together, and we have to recognise our common purpose. And as I say, Lens is one of those structures that's going to give us that common purpose. So for SEPA, this is a really exciting area of work that we want to see develop and grow, and we are very, very, very much committed to.
Right, and I guess, Kenny, you know, regulators quite often find point sources a lot easier to regulate and get involved in than, you know, a whole place in its entirety. I mean, do you see that as being a way of evolving things in the future? Because I can see that this integrated, multi-dimensional, multifunctional approach is something that, you know, really lends itself to a different relationship with and a different tool in the armory of a regulator as well.
Absolutely, Martin. I mean, there will never ever be a replacement from our traditional regulatory role. What I see in the future is that role being greater, having a greater focus and a greater impact, because we are working in these types of ways. So we know where we need those point source interventions, because we're working in these ways and understanding where the challenge lies, where the opportunities lies, and where we can do things smarter. So for me, we will always have that role, and I think we should jealously guard that role. But going forward, what we need is just the type of approach that Chris spoke about, where multiple benefits are being achieved by single interventions at a boardroom or at a business level, at a partnership level. And that's where, for me, that's where the maximum value will be achieved. And that's where we'll get that step on from compliance as a foundation, compliance as a minimum, and beyond compliance being the goal, not just for the regulator, but for those people that we're working with in the regulated side, whether that's directly or indirectly.
Right, thank you, Kenny. I'm going to turn to Mark Brooking now from First Milk, because I think, you know, Lens clearly puts farmers and land managers at the centre of its delivery programme. And, you know, First Milk engaged at the early stages of Lens development. But, you know, what do you see as the key benefits for your members?
Thanks very much, Martin. Actually, it's like, I suppose as a farmers cooperative, we sort of, you know, naturally sort of collaborate, and actually, it's like, you know, our members were certainly actually, is like, you know, very interested in actually working together. It's just like, you know, in order to be able to deliver benefits. But one of the key benefits for them would be actually is like the knowledge transfer, which you can actually gain by working with various organizations. And it's so important that actually, you know, farming's changing, actually is like, you know, all the time. And therefore having the latest research and developments, because the needs are very different now than they necessarily is actually 20 or 30 years ago. I suppose the other key thing, which is like, you know, it does improve sort of like increased revenue streams. So it gives another opportunity to actually, is like, you know, is get some form of additional revenue out of actually, is like, you know, through you know, working with other organizations, which clearly then actually is like, you know, would improve their resilience. Actually is like, you know, and it gives them a greater opportunity to actually is like then further invest in their business, which enables them to deliver for other projects as well. So it can be a real virtuous circle. And I think it's an added interest to actually is, for the business to actually is like, again, it gives them more of actually interest in the future. So they'll carry on farming for a longer time.
Right. And so, I mean, what engagement, what are the outcomes that this engagement has helped farmers and land managers to achieve from your perspective?
Well, I mean, the outcomes have been quite phenomenal, really. Actually, it's like, and I think we've kind of seen actually, it's like, right throughout the organisation, not just those involved in some of the programs, but working with other organisations. We'll have had a series of workshops whereby we would have invited people from SEPA, various customers actually like along to these workshops. And that whole piece of actually is like, making our members understand actually is like, is that they're part of a wider food chain. And also is part of actually is like, building natural capital is one thing. And it's something that they really enjoy doing. But I would also like to introduce the concept of actually is like is building social capital. So having a sense of belonging to something and working together for a common purpose actually is something that the members really have actually have bought into. And the work we do with identifying there's different needs within the group. So we have a next generation group, so for younger members or family members of the owners of the business actually are important. Likewise, we have a women in agriculture group that actually again have different interests and actually different insights, and therefore making sure that they are basically involved as well. The whole thing actually is like, it's kind of led to, it's a changing a mindset in terms of, so we're looking at very much developing regenerative farming, and which requires that holistic approach. So it's not just about carbon, it's not just about biodiversity, it's not just about animal welfare. It's actually looking at the whole piece. And actually, it's like, goes back to my previous point, actually building that sort of financial resilience and actually is also equally important. So as I say, the outcomes actually have been wide reaching. Actually, it's like, more than just the financial benefits that some members have received.
Great, and I think that point about community and social capital really echoes the comments that we heard from Alistair as well in Alan. So I think that's really coming through nicely. We have a question actually from somebody who's dialed in, just asking about from a supply chain, from a supply side. So and maybe this would be a good question for you, Mark. Is what are the biggest hurdles do you see for farmers maybe making that first step and getting involved?
Well, I think there's certainly some nervousness actually, is like particularly when you're looking at interventions whereby there's potential regulations involved as well. So there's that nervousness. I think as well as it does help if actually is like, I suppose we're the supply aggregator, we're a cooperative, so people are choosing to cooperate together. Having other members, farmers get involved, it's quite difficult because they are very isolated. So somebody to bring them together, I think, is actually really important. And for one project, we've actually had we've had people that have joined our cooperative almost purely on the back of actually is like a Lens initiative, because we've got the right way of thinking, and basically they're a part of something a little bit bigger, so they're not doing it individually between which is like themselves and a large organization.
Right, thank you, Mark. That's been fantastic. I mean, I think what we've heard from all of the contributors that whether it's from businesses and coming together and trying to blend common interests, whether it's those farmers and those in the landscapes who are looking to supply, and the views of the regulator, there are the multiple different benefits that this is already starting to show is absolutely fantastic, really, and has multiple benefits coming through. Now, we're now going to move on to look at some of the key insights and learnings that have been drawn from the Landscape Enterprise Network programme. So we're going to be hearing from Professor Mark Reed from the Scottish Rural University College, and also Annie Leeson from AgriCarbon. So Mark, we're going to hear from you first.
Fantastic, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you all today about our research. As you can see on the screen here, this is the Resilient Dairy Landscapes project, and we're funded by the UK government's research councils through the Global Food Security Programme. And we're just coming to the end of our project now, so it's a nice time to be able to talk about this and share some of our results. So you can see the consortium on the screen here. As Martin just said, I'm from Scotland's Rural College, SRUC, but collaborating with universities from the north of England through the N8 Agri-Food Initiative and a range of non-academic partners as well. Our goal is very simple. We wanted to know, do landscape enterprise networks actually work in practice? And to do this, we conducted social science and legal research in Cumbria, East Anglia and Southwest Scotland. Some of that's still ongoing, and natural and veterinary science in Cumbria to evaluate the outcomes of LENS. And in summary, based on this research, we now have some really robust evidence that LENS, first of all, delivers benefits for animal health and soil carbon storage. We're still analysing our biodiversity data. And LENS is typically preferred by farmers and so delivers net zero targets faster than publicly funded agri-environment schemes. And I'll tell you more about both of those points as I progress. So let's zoom in on the animal health results to start with, and this is work that's been led by the University of Liverpool. We started here with a concern that hedgerow and tree planting in LENS might in fact create breeding sites for culicoides midges, which are a vector of blue tongue disease. Our research, however, has shown that changes in midge numbers after planting are unlikely to affect national spread of the disease. And so, despite concerns, the conclusion is LENS does no harm, in this respect at least. Secondly, we looked at the abundance of dwarf pond snails, which cause liver fluke infection in dairy herds, to see whether any of the, well, one of the interventions, in fact, for inlands, which is fencing off watercourses, actually has an impact on this disease. And we found that farms with fenced off watercourses had in fact got significantly lower dwarf pond snail abundance, and as a result, a much lower likelihood of liver fluke infection. So clear benefits of, there's clear evidence of benefits for animal health as well. Next, we looked at soil carbon storage and biodiversity on farms implementing LENS. As I said, our biodiversity work is ongoing. This has been led by the University of Leeds. And we found that hedgerow planting results in significant amounts of carbon accumulating in the soil beneath them. And using this data, we were then able to estimate how much carbon hedgerow planting could sequester if we were to meet the Committee on Climate Change target on increasing hedgerow length by 40% by 2050. And the answer is an impressive 8 megatons of carbon in hedgerow soils alone, equivalent to offsetting 5% of total agricultural CO2 emissions per year over the next 50 years. But there is a problem. At current planting rates under the publicly funded agri-environment scheme, it would take over 200 years to achieve the committee's target. But the good news is that LENS was able to achieve significantly faster planting rates. And scaling these up to the rest of the country, we've estimated that it could take just 16 years to reach that same target via LENS. Now, I'm not suggesting this is necessarily either desirable or achievable, but I think the difference in uptake is quite striking. And this, of course, leads me to my third and final set of evidence that we've produced, which is the social science and legal research that we've been doing. This is work that's been led by the University of Newcastle with inputs from my team at SRUC. And farmers interviewed for our research said very clearly that they preferred private investment via Lens to publicly funded environments, agri-environment schemes. And the main reasons for this were the additional stable income for easily planned and reported activities that they considered as being flexible and compatible with the stuff that they were already doing on farm. But secondly, farmers were motivated to join the scheme because they did want to actually improve environmental outcomes and, of course, animal health. And these are findings primarily from Cumbria, the papers that you can see on the screen there. But we are now interviewing land managers in East Anglia, where the first phase of Lens is already 40% oversubscribed by farmers. Finally, I've personally been working with Tom and Andy and others on the market side of Lens, in particular, thinking about how Lens can integrate payments for multiple ecosystem services with carbon markets. So, for example, the Woodland Carbon Code or the Peatland Code. I sit on its executive board. And I'm part of a consortium with Annie, who we're going to hear from in a moment, and others, drawing on evidence from this project to develop a UK farm soil carbon code that is designed to protect the interests of farmers, project developers, and investors, and hopefully incentivize a large-scale transition to regenerative agricultural practices that are good for the climate and biodiversity. If you want any of the papers I cited on the screen, you can get them from our website, where you can also download my slides from today. But do stay in touch if you want to get any of the stuff that's kind of more in press or just discuss our findings. My contact details are on the screen now. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mark. And now we're going to hear from Annie Leeson from AgriCarbon. So, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everybody. So I'm Annie Leeson, co-founder and CEO of AgriCarbon. And we've got a very clear and simple mission, which is to unlock the value of soil as a carbon sink. Coming back to what Andy was saying at the beginning, there's a lot of benefits around soil health, but carbon's often put at the centre. But incredibly, we still have a gap around the ability to reliably measure soil carbon stock. So our mission is to solve that by giving farmers access to very cost-effective, very high-intensity, direct soil carbon testing, so that they can provide a reliable quantification of their carbon stock. And critically, they can provide reliable evidence of soil carbon storage and sequestration. The key issues with measuring soil carbon pretty much start and end with the variations, the variability of soil. There are 747 different types of soil in the UK, over 300,000 around the world. And each soil type has different levels of soil carbon, sequesters carbon in different ways, depends on climate as well, depends on what's growing from and living in the soil, and of course, depends on how the soil is being farmed. So there is a huge natural background of variation, and against that variation, we're trying to measure what amounts to a relatively small percentage terms change in soil carbon. Now, acre by acre, that adds up to a really big carbon sequestration benefit, but the percentage change is small, and proving using statistically significant measurement that that small change is real against a background of very high natural variation is absolutely dependent on having a high number of measurement points. And that, of course, can become very expensive. There are essentially three ways that you can measure soil carbon today. The first is direct measurement. So soil samples taken from the field, often in a plastic bag, usually sent to a lab. It's a very robust, well understood process, but it's very expensive. If you pay a professional to collect the soil as well as provide the analysis, you could be talking about between 50 and 150 pounds per sample to carry out direct soil testing this way. So it's used relatively sparingly. The second category has huge promise, and a lot of development work's gone into this recently, for sensors and other proxy measures. And these are absolutely fantastic for showing direction of travel. They really help farmers to understand how different interventions are changing soil carbon conditions as well as other nutrients. The issue, that there are a couple of ways in which these fall down. The first is that most of these technologies will only look at the topsoil. So they're not looking at full soil depth, which is what you need to calculate carbon stock. Probably the bigger problem is that for these sensors to be accurate, they need to be calibrated against the soil type and the circumstances in which they're being used. Going back to the variability, you can see how that would be the case. And that calibration has to come from ground truth data, which is direct sample testing. We're back to the cost issue again. Third area, incredible progress being made in this around the world, is modeling carbon change, and it's absolutely essential. We talked before about the importance of carbon in business cases. That's got to look forward at what you're going to sequester or you hope to sequester in future. But modeling requires a high quantity of very high quality inputs if you're going to get high quality outputs. You also have to calibrate what you're modeling against the changes that you're seeing on the ground. Again, we come back to this first point, which is the need for direct soil testing. So somebody needs to make direct soil testing accessible and affordable at scale. And that is the nature of agricarbon's service and our mission. So we take what we believe to be the best-in-class scientific methods. So do-mass dry combustion, for anybody who's familiar with the technicalities, lab-based process that identifies soil organic carbon from samples. But instead of doing that in a lab, we've built a machine. It's more of a factory line than a neat little machine. It includes lots of robotics and clever mechanical design. But it allows us to process a very high number of samples very quickly with really high consistency compared to using even one lab, let alone lots of different labs. But importantly, at a fraction of the cost that it would take through a conventional laboratory. Additionally, we actually extract the soil from the field. A couple of reasons for this. First is if you want to provide a really high integrity view of soil carbon, you need the independence and the consistency of a third party extracting the samples. But also, quite frankly, just because we are really good at it, we've got excellent machinery which allows us to be very efficient. On the left here, you can see Carbon Force 1 with a hydraulic soil probe on the back. We have Carbon Force 2, Carbon Forces 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are on their way. And we're working with a fantastic company called Ruralink to create veteranships that actually recruit ex-military personnel in to pilot our fleet of carbon forces and manage them. And these extract soil cores. This is a bit of a short one, but generally up to 1 meter deep, 4 centimeters diameter. And they are retained in this all the way through to the final process so that we can look at soil carbon at different depths. And really importantly, we're also able to look at the structure of the soil at each depth and measure the density of the soil, which is crucial when you come to calculating soil carbon stock. To complete the service, we also start with the sampling strategy, science and statistical based, so that from the end to end, you've got independence, you've got the ability to reduce uncertainty at every stage, and you've got a fully auditable process. The result is very high capacity, very highly consistent science-based approach to direct sampling, 100% direct sampling calculation of soil carbon stock, provided as an independent service at a significant cost saving versus what could be achieved today. Over 90%, somewhere between 90 and 97%, depending on what the alternative methods are that are being employed. And the cost saving is important because it allows us to take such a high number of samples. So we've done a lot of work with Mark's farms in First Milk. And if you take a typical, let's say a 300-acre farm, we're calculating soil carbon stock, full soil depth across the farm, using over 1,000 samples for each farm. And that level of robustness of understanding soil carbon stock at baseline and then retesting in a few years' time is not possible any other way today. What it also means is when you start to bring farms together, for example, through the lens process, where you've got clusters and communities of farms working together, each cluster is going to quickly accrue the most extensive databases of soil carbon data anywhere in the world, from intensive direct testing to full soil depth. And building on that wealth of data, that evidence base, we're going to continue working with Lens and other partners to develop a multifunctional assessment platform, including water and habitats, so that we can unlock the potential of really good soil stewardship to deliver material environmental benefits beyond carbon across the board. And thank you very much. I will hand you back to Martin.
Great, thank you, Annie and Mark. Really good to firstly see some of the evidence coming through in terms of the benefits and delivering on the outcomes, because that's absolutely crucial. And secondly, a great insight into not just the challenge of measuring and quantifying soil carbon stocks, but also that opportunity to drive down costs and get a robust set of data. I think Mark there as well, because I've got a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind. Maybe while Mark is coming back on, hopefully, but whether we can spotlight him as well. So Mark, you mentioned biodiversity, and at the moment we haven't got the evidence base in yet. What sorts of timescales are you expecting to be able to see biodiversity enhancements on landscapes through the lens process? Because clearly ecological time is certainly differs to political time frames. I know that, but be interesting to get a perspective about when you might anticipate that, or is this just a function of organising the research?
Yeah, so we've got measurements going on hedgerows ranging up to 40, 45 years. And clearly at that age, you can instantly see birds nesting, a range of other kind of activities. So clearly at that point, but I think in terms of the earlier, we're going to wait, we'll analyse the data. I would expect to see significant benefits within 5 to 10 years. It's all about the habitat structure that enables different species to effectively move in and fill different niches. It will depend on the species. It will depend on the length of time it's been there, and we will be able to confirm with some more specific data by the end of second half of next year is when we should have that data all completely logged and analysed. For people online, I'll maybe share a link to a recent review of evidence on biodiversity in hedgerows with a bit more detail.
Great, thanks, Mark. And do you see variability between, I think you've got examples in dairy landscapes in, Cumbria and South Scotland, but also maybe arable in East Anglia. I mean, are you seeing big differences in terms of the rates in which benefits accrue? Is that a function of the degradation, the existing degraded state of some landscapes?
I think each of these lens, as we've heard from Andy and Tom earlier on, have a different focus. And with the arable lens sites, a much stronger focus on regenerative agricultural practices that can store soil carbon. And that's where we've been, where we are focusing our efforts to build a UK farm soil carbon code. There's a potential in future to move that into grassland systems and elsewhere, but we're starting that in arable systems and hoping to get that working as part of Lens. I think there's huge potential to integrate carbon markets already. We've got a peatland code, a woodland carbon code, as Andy said, but we're already investigating peatlands as part of LENS. So it really depends on each landscape and what the assets are that you have that different business interests value.
Great, thanks, Mark. And just turning to Annie, because it's interesting that you're looking to measure soil stocks, soil carbon stocks, and I just wonder, is there an indication of how much variability at different depths you might expect to see over what scale of time, and just when would you be going? When would you need to go back to start to be able to show that soil carbon has hopefully increased in terms of weaving out stocks and the kind of the flows and measuring the flows and hopefully understanding that we are becoming regenerative in terms of soil carbon. What sorts of timescales would we be looking for on that?
Yeah, so really good questions. Starting with I'll start from the back and we'll talk about timeframes. Our view is that we ought to be looking to ground truth, which is what we call the real measurement, at very least every 5 years. But we're quite interested to see if with the increase in certainty we get from taking so many samples, we may be able to demonstrate change much sooner. That's all going to come down to the results and the statistics and what we call power analysis, which looks at how much variation have you got, therefore what degree of change do you need to see before you can show that it's statistically significant. The bigger the sample base, the more easily we can do that. So we're aiming, certainly with, for example, first milk farms, we will go back to certainly a large proportion of those and look in 3 years. Really having this intensity of data is pretty much the first opportunity that we're going to have to use some of the more sophisticated statistical methods to work out what the ideal retesting period is. You just don't have enough data to do that until you've got these kind of tens of thousands of data points from a relatively small plot of land. Your other question was about depth. It's a really good question, and in fact, one of the biggest challenges today is there's not enough data about soil carbon at depth. Huge speculation. Some naysayers saying, well, you might see an increase in topsoil, but if you see a decrease in depth and you're not measuring depth, how do you know what's going on? We don't expect to see that, but at least now we are consistently, with every single point that we're looking at, we're looking down up to a metre. Very few soils go down that deep in the UK unless they're peat. But we're looking at 0 to 15, 15 to 30, 30 to 60, 60 and beyond. Generally, we're seeing a fairly conventional, your soil carbon percentage goes down with depth unless you've got peat in the soil. But what you're also seeing is your density goes up as you go down the depths. So your carbon stock calculation is slightly modified by both of these. And again, this is where the importance of understanding the density of the soil, not just the concentration of carbon, becomes really important. But that data on the soil depth is a huge miss, and it's one of the issues with some of the modelling approaches at the moment, because they're just looking at what can you infer from 30 centimetres of soil without enough data to really understand the dynamics of that deeper level. And over time, I'm afraid it's not going to be an immediate answer, but over time we will build an absolutely unparalleled ability to view that based on real measurement at high intensity.
Fantastic. And I think as we start to be able to blend our understanding of the ability to enhance soil carbon over time, and then start to link that to, for example, understanding what impact potentially that has on biodiversity benefits as well. Absolutely. Over time. I think that there are these multifunctional and multidimensional benefits. Looking at the environment as a system through a landscape, I think is incredible. So thank you very much for that. I'm now going to be handing over to Andy, because I think, well, firstly, Andy, thank you and Tom for setting us up on this session. I think it's been incredibly enlightening, and it's really good to see something so progressive but actually tangible in terms of delivering benefits in places. It's so encouraging to see. So thank you for that, and all of the contributors. It's been, a really nice journey through the session. But Andy, I think you have a really quite important announcement to make, haven't you?
Yes. So first of all, thanks very much, Martin, for chairing the session very, very efficiently today. It's taken me to the wrong slide there. Just 1 second. So yes, as I was saying, first of all, thanks very much for your input, Martin. Very efficient chairing and on time, which is great. I'll make sure we don't run over time in my last couple of minutes. And similarly, thanks very much to all of the participants, speakers today. It's provided a really rich and diverse set of perspectives and insights from where we are and also where we're going. Also, thank you very much for all the participants online who are joining us and listening to what we've had to say today. In terms of the announcement, I think what we touched on very early on was, Lens is focused on driving real scale and pace in terms of landscape restoration, very much on a multifunctional basis. We've heard some great examples there of where we're driving real practical assessment around carbon, but really looking at how we leverage this, across both delivery and measurement and verification of other outcomes within those landscapes as well. But what's really important is from the outset, we've always driven this on the basis of Lens being an independent proposition, which can bring together a whole range of different parties from across the landscape in terms of demand side, supply side, and those enabling functions as well. I'm really, really pleased to say that next month we will be launching Lens as a genuinely incorporated independent entity. So it'll be structured in terms of the lead organisation as an organisation which is limited by guarantee, rotating its profits through to really accelerate landscape transformation, with the regional programmes set up as, in effect, what we would call community interest companies. So again, cycling the profits locally within those landscapes. That means that any organisation can lean in and play a role. It also means that the programme is very much, as we touched on before, community-centric and driving that community proposition. But the really crucial piece is that, as we heard earlier, we need to lean in and take action now. We really can't afford to wait. And that's not just because we have some significant challenges to achieve within the next 10 years, let alone by 2050, but also that we really need to lean in now to build understanding, insight, and build that evidence base around those different interventions so we can refine our actions and further increase scale and pace. So as a result, what I'd like to say to anyone who's listening to this session, no matter where you are, from an organisational perspective, if you feel that you could play a role, then I'd welcome you to contact us through the email address office@3keel.com. Again, feel free to go to the Landscape Enterprise Network's website and contact through there. But to reach out and look at how you may be able to join Lens and play a role in terms of not just enabling delivery, but also helping to shape the model going forwards to accelerate that delivery. So really exciting times. We're already seeing significant growth, significant interest, but keen to draw more players in to help accelerate that proposition. And on such a point, again, just like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for today and look forward to working together.